Spain executed Túpac Amaru in public. The rebellion still spread. That's when the empire realized this was no longer a revolt, it was a breakdown. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. In 1780, on a cold road near Tinta in the southern Andes, the Spanish Empire learned a truth it had spent centuries trying not to hear. The Andes were not truly conquered. They were obeying out of habit, fear, and exhaustion. Then José Gabriel Condorcanqui took the name Túpac Amaru II, seized a royal magistrate, and suddenly the road that carried tribute and silver began carrying something else. A memory with a knife in its teeth. That is the question hanging over this story. Was this only a tax revolt that got out of hand? Or did the crown, amid broader colonial tensions and global shifts in empire power, feel the old conquest itself beginning to crack? The man at the center was no outlaw from the shadows. José Gabriel Condorcanqui was a hereditary indigenous lord, a trader, a muleteer, a litigant, a man who knew the colonial machine from the inside. That made him dangerous before a single shot was fired. Look at the map from above, and Bourbon rule seems solid. Cusco, the Collao, Lake Titicaca, the road into Upper Peru, parish networks, tax routes, militias, magistrates, mule trains. On paper, it looks like an order. Up close, it was a web held together by tired hands and uneasy loyalties. The empire was not a wall. It was a road bridge, and too many planks were already rotten, highlighting how easily the empire's grip could falter, inspiring concern about its stability. The southern Andes were already combustible long before Túpac Amaru raised a banner. Tribute kept bleeding communities year after year. The labor draft, the mita, dragged men toward the mines, especially the silver world tied to Potosi. Then there was the forced distribution of goods, that hated system that let officials turn office into business and villages into captive markets. The crown called this administration. The people below it knew better. They felt the weight in grain, cloth, coin, livestock, and debt. But pressure alone does not make rebellion. Plenty of empires squeeze and still survive. What changed in the highlands was something more intimate. People began to read their suffering as a form of dishonor. Colonial power was not just heavy, it was violating the limits that communities believed even power should respect. Reciprocity broke. Justice felt rented out. Humiliation spread faster than hunger. And once a people stop seeing abuse as normal bad luck and start seeing it as illegitimate rule, the ground begins to move. Even the church, which should have sounded like a refuge, was woven into the tension. Priests were not floating above village life like saints in a painted sky. They were inside it, tangled in money, status, punishment, ethnicity, and local quarrels. Some defended the order, some angered their own flocks. That matters because later, when blood and fire entered sacred space, royal society would seize on the horror at once. In the Andes, altar and empire had stood too close together for too long. José Gabriel Condorcanqui understood all of this because he traveled the roads where he lived. He dealt in mules, moved through markets, petitioned courts, and watched how power turned every distance into profit. His leadership became a symbol of hope, inspiring indigenous communities to see justice and loyalty as more than words. He sounded legible, he sounded dangerous, he sounded like a beginner learning how to speak. Then he chose the name that made the mountains lift their heads, Túpac Amaru II. Not a costume, not a flourish, a summons rooted in indigenous history and identity. The name reached back to the last great Neo-Inca rebel executed in the 16th century. With that choice, the uprising stopped sounding like a provincial complaint and began sounding like unfinished history. The conquest, which the empire treated as a settled fact, suddenly felt like an old wound reopening. For colonial elites, that name was not nostalgia. It was an accusation and a call for indigenous sovereignty. And this is where terror enters the story in two voices at once. There was real violence, yes, executions, ambushes, sieges, reprisals, mutilation, and the destruction of property are tied to domination. But there was also the terror of interpretation. Rumor, prophecy, elite panic, fantasies of total race war, the fear that the majority might stop obeying the minority that ruled it. Once Túpac Amaru carried that name into the countryside, many Spaniards did not hear rebellion. They heard the past coming back armed. The open rupture came on November 4th, 1780. Antonio de Arriaga, the royal magistrate known as a corregidor, a man tied to abuse and extraction, was seized. Notice what that meant. Authority was no longer being petitioned, it was being judged. A royal official could be taken on an Andean road like any other man. 6 days later, on November 10th, Arriaga was hanged. The rebellion had crossed a line no legal appeal could uncross. The empire's servants were no longer untouchable. That hanging mattered far beyond one man's death. Arriaga was not just a body on a rope. He represented the entire system of colonial exploitation and the suppression of indigenous resistance. His execution told village after village that the colonial chain could be struck at its visible links, but it also signaled to officials that the rebellion was a challenge to colonial authority itself, inspiring future resistance and shaping policies. Once subjects begin punishing those who govern them, the empire feels the ground open beneath its feet. Then came Sangarará on November 18th, and the shock became fire. Royalist forces were defeated. A church filled with trapped fighters and civilians became the center of devastation when flames and chaos turned stone into a tomb. The details have been argued over ever since, as they always are when smoke covers everything. But the political effect was immediate. The rebellion now had an image, and images travel faster than armies. Across the Andes, fear outran fact and kept running. Royalist voices used Sangarará relentlessly. A burning church let them paint the rebels as enemies of religion, civilization, and God himself. That helped harden city elites, stiffen hesitant loyalties, and justify vengeance. But wait, notice this. Propaganda works best when it lands on real fear. They needed Sangarará, because ordinary prestige was no longer enough. One defeat had already revealed how thin the imperial skin really was. Smoke only made the wound visible. After Sangarará, every road pointed toward one terrible question. Could the rebels take Cusco? This was not just another town on a ledger. Cusco was the former Inca capital, the great urban heart of the region, a storehouse of memory and power. If it fell quickly, the rebellion would gain food, weapons, legitimacy, and a symbolism almost impossible to overstate. The road to Cusco became the road the empire could not stop staring at. No one understood that better than Micaela Bastidas. Too many old tellings pushed her to the edge of the frame, as if she were standing politely behind great men. The letters she left behind tell a harsher truth. She saw that speed was everything. Strike now, advance now, do not let the enemy breathe. She grasped what empires know and insurgencies forget at their peril. Delay is not neutral. Delay is a gift handed to the side with deeper reserves. But the city was not seized in that first decisive moment. The rebels pressed. Cusco trembled. Yet hesitation, conflicting pressures, logistics, and the sheer difficulty of turning rural uprising into urban conquest opened a crack. The crown poured survival through it. Reinforcements gathered. Urban elites found their nerve. Potential allies hesitated. The failure to capture Cusco did not end the rebellion. It did something crueler. It created a great historical almost. The moment when the empire looked most vulnerable, it then found enough breath to keep killing. Still, the fire did not die. It spread through Tinta, Quispicanchi, Canas, Canchis, the broader Cusco region, the Collao, the Lake Titicaca Basin, and into Upper Peru. This was no village riot. It became a mass Andean emergency. Different communities entered it for different reasons: rage against tribute, hatred of forced goods, loyalty to rebel leaders, local feuds, old memory, survival, and opportunity. A rebellion grows like mountain weather. It gathers many currents before it becomes a storm. Women moved through this storm with far more power than schoolbook versions like to admit. They carried intelligence, organized supplies, pushed strategy, preserved networks, fed armies, and sometimes drove events with harder clarity than the men around them. Micaela Bastidas is the name most people know, but she was not alone. The Andean Rebellion had many hands, many watchers, many messengers moving under shawls, through kitchens, overpasses, across markets, in the spaces the empire had learned not to see. And yet this was not a simple war of Indians against Spaniards. No matter how badly frightened elites wanted it to look that way, some indigenous communities remained loyal to the crown, some shifted sides. Some indigenous nobles feared losing their own place inside the colonial world. Some mestizos, artisans, and Creoles sympathized for a time, then recoiled when the conflict deepened. Colonial society was not splitting along one clean line. It was breaking along many lines, making the war even harder to predict. That unpredictability terrified the crown, because it did not keep a giant iron fist waiting in the Andes. The empire looked immense, but on this terrain its force had to be assembled in a hurry. Militias, local allies, provincial networks, emergency recruitment, desperate intelligence, and improvised marches through cold and high altitude. A fully secure regime does not govern this way. It punishes from strength. Here, Spanish rule had to improvise while pretending it was merely issuing orders. Geography sharpened everything. The southern Andes are not land you hold like a blanket spread flat on a table. You hold corridors, passes, towns, river valleys, supply routes, and the bridges between one high plateau and the next. Break the road, and a city becomes an island. Interrupt the mule train, and a magistrate becomes a prisoner inside his own jurisdiction. On a map, the empire still looks whole. On the ground, it starts to feel like a lantern in a windstorm. This was not a distant frontier the crown could afford to worry about later. The southern Andes connected Peru to Upper Peru and to the silver arteries beyond. Labor, revenue, food, pack animals, orders, and prestige all moved through that corridor. A rebellion there threatened more than provincial dignity. It threatened one of the empire's vital organs. That is why officials read each blocked road not as local mischief, but as a wound opening near the center of imperial life. That is why numbers alone do not tell the whole story, though the numbers were already frightening. The wider insurgency drew in tens of thousands across several fronts. Death spread through the tens of thousands as rebellion and repression fed each other. But scale was not only demographic, it was spatial, logistical, and psychological. A local disturbance can be isolated. A mass uprising stretched across mountains, plateaus, and market routes is something else. It makes every neighboring province imagine itself next. Rumor did the rest. One town rises, and another town hears. It was 3 towns. One magistrate dies, and the next hears that every magistrate on the road has vanished. One siege begins, and cities store grain as if they were already abandoned. That does not mean fear was fake. It means fear became a second battlefield. News moved fast. Truth moved slowly. In that space between them, panic built its own army. The movement also became more radical as it widened. Early on, Túpac Amaru could speak of justice, of defending Christian morality, even of loyalty to the king against corrupt local men. But war has a way of stripping polite language from old structures. Soon it was not only officials who stood accused, but the institutions beneath them: tribute, forced labor, privileged peninsular power, the racial ladder of colonial society itself. This is why the rebellion cannot be filed away as a mere reform movement. At the same time, it was not a neat 19th century independence campaign either. No single modern program united everyone inside it. Some wanted relief from abuse. Some wanted a deeper overturning of the colonial order. Some fought for local reasons that did not travel well to the next valley. The power of the rebellion came from that breadth. Its weakness came from the same place. It was broad enough to shake the empire, but not always unified enough to replace it. When rebel violence intensified, it was not random cruelty floating in the air. Officials were executed because they embodied extraction. Spaniards born in Spain were attacked because they stood at the privileged summit of a hated order. Property linked to exploitation became a target because in a colonial world, power resides in objects as much as in laws. Warehouses, account books, roads, store goods, tribute lists, and the houses of those who profited from forced labor. Break those things, and you are not only destroying wealth, you are destroying it. You are interrupting the rule. But to colonial elites, that violence always looked larger than itself because they read it through conquest memory. Their deepest fear was not one lost battle. It was a reversal. What happens when those who pay tribute stop paying? What happens when those who carry the empire decide to drop it? What happens if the social pyramid is not merely criticized, but flipped? This was the nightmare hiding inside every royalist report. Sangarará remained the image that fed that nightmare. A church in flames is not easily forgotten. It allowed royalists to say the rebels were not men with grievances, but monsters outside the moral world. Yet something is revealing in how quickly that image spread. Colonial authority needed a theater of horror because the old habits of deference were weakening. Fear had to be reorganized. That is what propaganda does when prestige alone no longer convinces. Then the war taught cities a slower lesson. Siege is a different kind of terror. Sudden death strikes like lightning. Siege is weather. It thins bread, slows letters, sharpens suspicion, and makes every closed gate feel like a confession of weakness. It teaches an urban elite what it never wanted to learn, that a city depends on the countryside around it, as a heart depends on lungs. Once that countryside stops obeying, the walls begin to mean less. And the wider Great Rebellion did not belong to Túpac Amaru alone. Related but decentralized uprisings rose across Charcas and around La Paz under leaders tied to the Qatari movement, especially Túpac Katari and Bartolina Sisa. This matters because the crown was not facing one neat army with a single neat center. It was facing an Andean political field in flames, put out one fire, and another ridge glowed red in the dark. Nowhere was that more frightening than around La Paz. There, the siege stopped being a metaphor and became a lived condition. The city felt the countryside withdraw its obedience. Supplies wavered. Relief became uncertain. Urban life shrank into waiting, rationing, rumor, prayer, and fear of betrayal from within. La Paz was not simply attacked. It was made to feel cut off from the world. For colonial society, that was existential. A city that can no longer trust the land that feeds it begins to understand how fragile its civilization is. By then, the crown had already made its decision about how to answer. It would answer with terror of its own. Túpac Amaru was captured in 1781, and in May of that year he was executed in Cusco. The point was not only to kill a rebel leader, the point was to crush a name, shame a memory, and stage imperial vengeance as public theater. The empire wanted the crowd to understand that history itself could be punished. Micaela Bastidas was killed too, with a brutality meant to warn the living. So were other leaders and kin. Bodies were attacked as messages. Limbs, spectacle, forced witnessing. The square turned into a lesson written in flesh. This was counter-terror as statecraft. A crown that once claimed to embody order now had to rebuild obedience with horror, because obedience was no longer arriving on its own. The road carried those messages outward, just as it had once carried rumor inward. But the war refused to end on cue. That is one of the most important truths in this story. Túpac Amaru's death did not restore calm by magic. The rebellion kept breathing under Diego Cristobal Túpac Amaru and under Andrés Túpac Amaru, and in overlapping Aymara insurgencies related to the same crisis, even when they were not identical in structure or aim. Kill the symbol, and the conditions remain. That is what frightened the empire most. A revolt that collapses with its leader can be explained away as seduction, charisma, madness, or one bad season. A revolt that survives the death of its most famous face is harder to dismiss. Then the crown has to admit, at least to itself, that the problem is deeper. Too many grievances, too many roads, too many people who now know the empire can be struck. Too many communities have tasted the dangerous thought that rule is not destiny. The crown also survived by relying on alliances it preferred not to talk about too loudly. Indigenous loyalists, local elites, rival communities, town militias, men with their own reasons to fear upheaval more than they feared peninsular arrogance. Colonial rule in the Andes was defended in part by people the colonial world claimed it already dominated. That does not make the system humane, it makes it fragile. Empires love the language of command, but in crisis they reveal how much of their survival depends on bargaining. So why did the rebellion not overturn Spanish rule altogether? The sharpest answer still returns to Cusco. That missed opening mattered. Had the city fallen early, the moral and military balance might have changed dramatically. Stores, recruits, symbols, prestige, hesitation in rival camps, panic in royal ones. The road to Cusco was the road to a different history, and it was not fully taken. Sometimes empires survive not because they are strong, but because their enemies arrive one moment too late. Coalition fragility mattered too. Some Creoles hated peninsular privilege, but feared indigenous popular power even more. Some indigenous nobles saw their future inside the colonial frame, not beyond it. Some communities joined for local reasons that could not be stitched into lasting regional coordination. This is one of the cruelest truths of anti-colonial history. Shared resentment does not automatically become shared revolution. The people most wounded by the empire do not all imagine the same cure. Political language also created both power and limits. Appeals to justice and loyalty to the king could initially draw broad sympathy. But as war widened and violence sharpened, many middling and property groups recoiled. The very force that made the uprising meaningful to the oppressed could make it terrifying to those halfway sheltered by the system. That is not a side note. It is the central problem of a revolutionary coalition in a caste society. And geography, which helped the rebellion spread, also made sustained coordination difficult. Mountains hide insurgents, slow armies, protect communities, and fracture command. The same distances that weakened the crown could also weaken the rebels. Messages took time, supplies thinned, local priorities pulled movements apart. The southern Andes produced overlapping rebellions rather than one perfectly synchronized machine. That made the insurgency harder to kill quickly, but also harder to unify into one enduring state-making force. Meanwhile, the crown learned under pressure. It concentrated troops where it could, improved intelligence, used negotiation and amnesty selectively, exploited local rivalries, strengthened loyalist networks, and then struck hard when openings appeared. Its eventual success should not be mistaken for effortless strength. This was an adaptation born of fear. A regime that feels safe does not have to relearn how to rule in the middle of a fire. A frightened regime does. When the smoke thinned, the old order did not return exactly as it had been. The crown did not simply shrug and continue with every arrangement untouched. It reworked parts of the colonial machinery, including the old corregidor order and the abusive commercial practices bound up with it, while deepening Bourbon control in other ways. That was not a full confession and not an act of mercy, but it was a sign that even the victors knew some structures had become too dangerous to leave alone. The result was not peace in any generous sense. It was a harder, more suspicious colonial order, more militarized, more watchful, less willing to trust the highlands it claimed to govern. The state had crushed the uprising, but it had also learned to fear the very populations that kept the region alive. Once an empire has seen obedience break, every festival, lineage claim, and village assembly can start to look like a rehearsal for the next fire. The authorities also went after memory itself. Inca symbols, noble descent claims, public echoes of the old royal past, visible cultural forms that might reactivate insurgent legitimacy, all of it drew suspicion. That response tells you what frightened them most. Not just armies, not just siege, imagination. A state confident in victory does not spend so much energy policing dress, ancestry, and historical memory. Only a haunted state does that. Later, elites would feel that haunting too. Many who had dreamed of independence still handled the name Túpac Amaru like live coals. Why? Because his memory carried more than patriotic color. It carried the possibility of indigenous leadership, social revolution from below, and a reckoning deeper than a change of flags. The rebellion remained dangerous long after its defeat because it had revealed who truly carried colonial society on their backs and what might happen if those shoulders rose. So, was the title true? Did this rebellion terrify the Spanish crown? Yes, but not because Madrid was one step from losing every colony in South America. The fear was more specific and, in some ways, more serious. In the southern Andes, the machinery of rule was in genuine danger of regional collapse. Roads failed, towns wavered, officials panicked, cities felt exposed. The crown discovered that the government in the highlands could break down much faster than it could be rebuilt. What Túpac Amaru II exposed was the secret empire that never wants to be spoken about. Colonial rule in the Andes rested on fragile intermediaries, coerced labor, negotiated loyalty, and the routine obedience of people who had every reason to stop obeying. That is why this story still burns. It was not only a revolt against taxes or a hated official, it was a revelation. The conquest was not as settled as the conquerors claimed. It was being maintained day by day, road by road, by hands that could let go. And once the empire hears that truth, it can never unhear it. In the cold mountain dark, Spain was not only fighting men with slings, muskets, and lances, it was fighting memory, geography, hunger, humiliation, and the old Andean understanding that power must answer for what it takes. The road that once carried silver toward the empire had begun carrying fear back the other way. That is why the name still echoes, not as legend alone, but as a warning. So when you think of Túpac Amaru II, do not ask only whether he won or lost. Ask which moment scared the empire more. Arriaga hanging on the road, the fire at Sangarará, the mist rush on Cusco, the siege lines tightening around highland cities, or the fact that the war kept burning after the crown tore its most famous rebel apart. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.